Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be with you. I'm Jason. I'm here in Honolulu right now. It's unfortunate that I could not be in the Philippines because it's summer. But anyway, I'm very happy to be sharing with you on this conversation and employing critical thinking strategies for teaching in flexible learning environments. So you can just call me Jason. I teach in the Department of Indo-Pacific Languages and Literatures at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, but at the same time, an affiliate faculty of Capital University. All right, so I would like to begin my presentation by talking about my positionality because you know what? Our identities, our subjectivities affect the teaching and learning process. And it's the same with your students. Their experiences, their identities actually affect their learning process. And that's proven by research. So I would like to begin by saying that I was born and raised in the Philippines and remain very connected to the people and culture. In fact, I go home to the Philippines almost every year. And I taught in the Philippines for 8 years, 3 of which at International School, Korean Oro, and 5 years at Capital University. And to some extent, even until today, I still serve Capital University in various ways. I would say that my expertise is in critical pedagogy and critical literacy, and also multilingualism. So I identify myself as a critical applied linguist, and I've done research in the Philippine educational context, and also have published some of my works about the Philippine educational experiences. So I would like to begin my presentation by talking about the presentation outline. So first, I'm going to try to define and also present the characteristics of critical thinking. I will also try to answer what does it mean to be a critical teacher, and then we will cover employing critical thinking in everyday teaching practices. Also, I would like to engage in this conversation about how do we reimagine teaching in flexible learning environments. After all, most of us have suddenly transitioned to online and different kinds of modes of teaching because of COVID-19. So we can definitely say that we are now in this flexible learning environments. Now, how do we apply critical thinking strategies, right? So, and then I would like also to push further the idea of critical thinking by saying that we need to make critical thinking more critical. And how do we do that? Okay. And then lastly and finally, I would like to talk about the intersection between critical thinking and critical literacy and critical digital literacy. Perhaps these ideas are rather new to many of you, but I would like to introduce these topics. All right. So I would like to encourage you guys that during this presentation, try doing the 3-2-1 reflection, right? As critical teachers, we need to be able to reflect on our practice, but at the same time, you can actually use this in your classes, right? So all you need to do is to remember 3 things that you learned. Second, 2 things that I am still curious about, and one way that I plan to use my new knowledge. So as I do my presentation and as you listen there in the comforts of your home, hopefully, please try to do the 3-2-1 reflection. And later on, I will ask you guys to post your reflection in the comment section. Is that a deal? All right, thumbs up. Okay, let us now proceed to the first part. Right. I don't know if you guys have actually read the Philippine Constitution. You know, it was a requirement when we were at the university level, right? But if you look at the Philippine Constitution, the notion of critical thinking is actually included in our Philippine Constitution. In fact, in Article 14, Section 3, it is stated very explicitly that educators or Philippine education should encourage critical and creative thinking among the youth, right? So therefore, it is part of our ethical duties as teachers to encourage critical thinking, not just among our students, but even among ourselves, right? We have to always practice critical thinking and in fact, encourage that. At the same time, it also behooves us to foster a learning environment that nurtures critical thinking. Now, what does it mean? Perhaps, you know, encouraging students to think critically of ideas that we actually provide them, or if not, to engage in critical thinking through various topics that we present in class, but perhaps also because I mean, perhaps also in ways of like assessment. So these are areas where we can engage our students in critical thinking and even ourselves. Okay, so now the idea is we need teachers who are critical thinkers, right? But are teachers who are able to think critically equivalent to critical teachers? Perhaps not really, because the literature, critical thinking and critical literacy or critical pedagogues have different definitions or philosophical or theoretical orientation or perspectives in terms of like how do we define critical thinkers and also critical teachers. But I would say that there is some common ground, they overlap, and it's very important that we discuss these ideas in this presentation. So I hope you guys are still interested and are continuing to listen there. So what does it mean to be critical? Well, according to Boyles and Burke, to be critical is to be more discerning in recognizing faulty arguments. So that's one. Second, we should be able to recognize hasty generalizations, you know, or sweeping generalizations as well. And third, this is very important, assertions lacking in evidence, and also truth claims based on unreliable authority, ambiguous or obscure concepts, right? So we have to think deeply about these things, especially now that there's a lot of fake news going around us. And also because a lot of our students now have access to technology. So as critical thinkers, we have to be able to recognize, okay, if these claims to truth are actually real, if there are actually pieces of evidence that would prove otherwise. Okay, so according to Paul and Elder, there are three dimensions of critical thinking. One is being analytic, at the same time evaluative, and the third is being creative. So analytic and evaluative, I think you guys are very familiar with this because this is in Bloom's taxonomy, right? And also creative is another aspect of critical thinking. I would even say that being creative is at the peak of critical thinking. So therefore, the goal is to be reflective and reasonable in order to decide on what to believe. So when you are reflective and reasonable, you make good decisions. You also make the teaching process, I think, more meaningful and relevant to your students. So let us go on and move to the next slide. Another very aspect of critical thinking, according to Paul and Elder, is that it is a process whereby a person reflects upon his or her own thinking process so as to create clear, well-reasoned ideas for the benefit of himself or themselves and others. So this is very important because when we're doing critical thinking, it's not just supposed to benefit us or ourselves, but actually it will benefit other people. And in our classroom, of course, those others are the students, right? And in our institution, those others refer to our colleagues. It referred to our administration. It referred to the educational experiences of our students, our colleagues, and everybody in education, in academia. So I hope that we always practice critical thinking and we are, able to provide this benefit for others as we practice critical thinking in our everyday teaching practices. All right, so let us now move to employing critical thinking in our everyday practices. And when I say everyday lives, this refers to, like events when we discuss ideas and information, and when we teach in flexible learning environments. So we have to ask these who, what, where, when, how, and when questions, right? So for instance, when we ask the who question, we say, who benefits from this? If there is an idea, if there is a proposal, we have to ask this question. Another, who is this harmful to? Who makes decision about this? And who is most directly affected, right? So again, exercising critical thinking. Another is, who would you also hear discuss this? Perhaps there's actually another perspective. Who would be the best person to consult? This one looks for the right authority, right? And who will be the key people in this, and then who deserves recognition for this? So these are basic questions, but they're important. And also, we have to ask what questions? What are the strengths and weaknesses, right? And what is another perspective? So for instance, if you have decided to just focus on online teaching, right? I think it's very important to ask like, what is another perspective? Because that might actually cause us trouble. What is the alternative? What would be a counter argument, right? So for instance, when you are presenting an idea in your class and a student challenges it, I think that's actually a very good mark of critical thinking. And as teachers, we should encourage our students to always practice that. Another what question would be, what is the best scenario? And what is the most or least important? And perhaps if it's very, not very important, perhaps we can actually move that to the side. But then at the same time, it's very important that we do recognize that something least important might actually be heavily influenced by our decisions, right? And what can we do to make a positive change? And I think that's very important. And the last what question is, what is getting in the way of our actions? Perhaps it could be our biases. Perhaps there's a part of us that are resisting. Like for instance, when we're doing flexible learning environments, right? A lot of our teachers perhaps are resisting, and it's because they're afraid to explore other ways of doing things. And how do we actually address that problem or concern? Now, by asking the right who and what questions, we seek to know who wields the power and authority behind something, right? So we think about that. At the same time, we also seek to know who gets to benefit and who gets harmed, if any. Again, we have to weigh these things when we're making, when we're taking actions. At the same time, and more importantly, what can we do to make a positive change, right? And of course, positive change is supposed to be our action when something, for instance, when our students are not moving or they're not making any progress, or perhaps a student drops out of our class suddenly in the middle of the semester, let's say 25% of our students. Now, what can we do to make a positive change, right? So these things, these questions allow us also to be reflective. All right. So now let's go to the where and when questions. Again, we ask these questions when we teach in flexible learning environments. We can always adapt these questions. I will not go over each one of them, but perhaps highlight some. So for instance, where is the most need for this, right? So for instance, if you have some budget perhaps, then where is the most need for this? And then where in the world would this be a problem, right? So perhaps there are concepts or ideas. For instance, when you talk about religion or you talk about marriage topics, this could be controversial, and perhaps it could be a problem in the real world. And where can we get more information? This reminds me of my former professor at Xavier. He said, and he rest in peace, he said that there are two kinds of intelligence. One is knowing the answer, and second is knowing where to find the answer. So that's very important. As teachers, I think now that there are a lot of resources available to us, we should be able to answer this question. And where do we go to for help with this? And I think that's a very important thing that we always have to consider. And very important, where are the areas for improvement? Again, this allows us to kind of like examine and be reflective of our own teaching practices and also our own approaches in teaching, pedagogical and also practical, right? And for the when question, we ask questions like, when is this acceptable or unacceptable? When would this benefit society? And when would this cause a problem? Right, so these are some of the very relevant questions. And when asking the right where and when questions, we seek to know the context and the experiences of people, example, students and teachers within that context. And we want to determine the right time for taking action, changing behaviors, and also accepting suggestions. Okay, all right. And of course, the last one is the why and how questions. These are also very important. Like for instance, if you think of the why question, I'll give you time to look at it. Why is this a problem, right? And why has it always been this way? Which is prompting us to, again, ask and reflect, but at the same time, explore possibilities of taking action. And the how do we know the truth about this? Again, going back to the definition of critical thinking earlier about, ascertaining the, the, ver- the veracity of certain information. And how can we change this for our good? And again, the our here is not just us, ourselves, but actually everyone in the educational community. Okay, so by asking the right why and how questions, we seek to assess why certain ideas and information might not be appropriate in certain contexts, right? Um, I think because we have to admit our educational experiences have been patterned from the U.S. because of our uh, history of colonialism. All right, perhaps there are certain ideas and information that might not be appropriate, especially in our local context, in the school milieu, wherever that we are teaching. And we also seek to uncover possible ways through which flexible learning environments work for our students. Again, this is very important because in flexible learning environments, and I think for all educational experiences, I think we have to remind ourselves that the center should be our students, right? Okay, now let us proceed to what Akbari suggests. Akbari suggests that there are at least um, 4 ways to actually transform our practices or praxis. Praxis means theoretically grounded practices. One is we have to base our teaching on students' local culture. And I think we have done that. Many of us have done that in the Philippines because, of course, the local culture. But then I guess we also have to explore and reflect on what do you mean by culture in that particular context. And another, because Akbari was talking from the applied linguistics background, we have to regard learners' first language as a resource to be utilized in learning. And whether you're teaching math, biology, science, or courses that are in the professional subjects, please take note that this learner's L1 is actually a resource. It should not be treated a burden. Coming from an applied linguist myself, please do note that there's a lot of studies that can prove that L1 use in the classroom, although it's done in English, for instance, or in Filipino, L1 is an important resource. So please do not stigmatize the use of L1 in the classroom. All right. And then we have to include more of students' real life concerns as well. Now it makes you think. I think there are actually ways to do that, especially in your assessment, right? So I was listening to Amphi and Arvin, and they were talking about applications in real life concerns. But at the same time, what about stories of struggles in the community or concerns that affect student lives, right? For instance, COVID-19, how many of you have actually, perhaps included some readings about COVID-19 to kind of like raise awareness about this pandemic and make our learner aware of issues faced by marginalized group. And that's very important because we're supposed to be doing critical thinking. And why is it that some people are privileged and why is it that some people are marginalized? And at the same time, what possible actions can we do to change the situation, right? And so that is a good transition because I would say that critical thinking may lead to critical literacy, which has 4 dimensions. One is disrupting the commonplace, meaning the status quo. And the second is interrogating multiple viewpoints, which is kind of similar to critical thinking, this dimension of critical literacy. Although critical literacy focuses on social political issues, right? Perhaps, I'm not so sure if your context allows that. Perhaps in some professional courses or in Gen Ed, we do engage our students, especially in the humanities, and that's why the humanities are very important. And also taking action and promoting social justice. So as teachers, I think we also have, again, that ethical issue to promote social justice because we do recognize that education is supposed to be the leveling field, right, for everyone. But we also do recognize that education has become a source of like hierarchization in society. All right. Now, in our teaching context, this means teachers should note that the curriculum exist within a social context. And the social context, right, there are many, right? But right now we are in this pandemic. And that's the reason why we are creating modules, we're creating teacher-produced learning contents and then publishing them online because the social context doesn't allow us the face-to-face interaction. But at the same time, there are many other social contexts around the curriculum. So please always remember that. Perhaps it could also be about some historical aspect. Like for instance, our curriculum in the Philippines was definitely influenced by certain events that happen, right? And also that the curriculum is a formal transmission of particular aspect of the culture's knowledge. We have to remember also sometimes that the curriculum can be very Western oriented, and therefore, we have to do or we have to take action as well, especially because, some scholars have said that or have criticized that Filipinos have been miseducated because of our very Western oriented curriculum. So therefore, we have to ask ourselves, should we teach indigenous ways of knowing in our schools? And do we allow students L1 in our classes? Yeah. I know that there are institutional policies that prohibit it, but then again, coming from the applied linguist, this is my opportunity to raise awareness for all of us that students L1 in the classroom should be used judiciously. And do we include local culture and perspectives in our syllabus? Sometimes it's really disturbing for me when I see people, like in their course materials, always representing white people, or if not Western looking people in their textbooks, or even in the videos that they created or on their slides. I think there is something wrong, and I think we should always rethink the way we think about these things. And our examples in our materials purely coming from Western cultures. Now, applying critical thinking and critical literacy, how do we create a more just and equitable, flexible learning environments? Especially because we know that not all of our students come from a privileged families, right, or a privileged family. Many of our students don't even have cell phones, or if they do have cell phone, they will have to share it with other members of their family. And also, do they actually have a quiet place to study? That's another important thing to consider. How do we make sure that students coming from low-income families then have equal access to learning materials? And again, please do not assume that our Generation Z students are proficient in the use of technology. That's, I think, a very elitist perspective, because many, especially those teaching in community colleges and in rural areas, we have students who maybe are familiar with Facebook, who maybe are familiar with the Gmail and all those things, but they don't know the affordances of these things. What are the aspects or ways to kind of like navigate through these apps or systems, right? And how do we create a grading system that is fair regarding of the modalities to which students demonstrate their learning? And do we grade students better if they choose the synchronous over the synchronous mode? So we have to, again, find a way that students are given equal opportunities to demonstrate learning without, like when they choose a particular mode of learning, without sacrificing fairness, right? So do we always have to take note of that? These are some of the ways through which other parts of the world, like teachers in other parts of the world, engage critically in their work. That I would say that this is more coming from a critical pedagogy perspective. Like for instance, Vinesh, she was doing dialogue in her classes, right? And they were talking about she included topics on LGBT issues to raise awareness about discrimination. Hammond also explored race and discrimination in her context. Lynn and also Lynn explored teacher ed program in Hong Kong by adding critical agenda in the curriculum. And Luke and Lynn explored criticality in L1 and L2, Like they found out that, yeah, so students tend to be more critical in their discussion when they're doing it in their first language, right? So definitely the current situation invites us to rethink or reimagine conventional ways of doing things in higher education, whether we like it or not, right? Um, so just imagine who would have thought that this was going to happen in 2020, in April and in February and March. I mean, sorry, in February and January, we were just celebrating. We were happy and we were optimistic that 2020 would be a great year. But then suddenly, it changed when March came. So I would like to now delve into flexible teaching um, in in flexible teaching learning environments or flexible learning. So flexible teaching, right? We have to again remember that the focus is learning, right? We of course are you know, the the characters behind the curtain, right? But we of course facilitate learning. So flexible teaching, flexible learning, but at the same time, the focus, the goal is again learning for our students to learn. Um, the question then is, what do we know about the success rate of students in face-to-face versus online teaching? Does anybody know, or does anybody have any idea how many percent, or what is the success rate of students in online teaching and learning? All right. So perhaps, yeah, that's a good question to ask, because the I think the Higher Education Journal in way back in 2010 published that when you do online teaching, only 50% of students actually succeed, and compared to face-to-face, which is around 75 or higher percent. Now that actually is a big difference, and we have to always pay attention to that, which means therefore that online learning is definitely challenging for a lot of students. We cannot assume that our students are comfortable with that, and perhaps that's the reason why many students want to go back to school and some parents want to send their children back to school. But again, of course, because of the health concerns, we're not going to do that. But then knowing the fact that many students could possibly drop out because of this online teaching and online learning experiences, what do we do, right, as teachers? At the same time, why might this new teaching and learning environment a challenge for some teachers? Does anybody have an idea? Please type your answer in the comment section. Okay, right. So let's go to the banking model of education. Okay, I would like to share this with you. According to Frary, back in 1978, education has become normalized and an act of depositing. And this was our everyday experiences before this online learning, where teachers, like deposit knowledge or information, and then from time to time we would withdraw from their deposits by conducting quizzes or exams, right? So that has become normalized in many of our students' experiences. And this is basically what we used to be, the everyday experiences of the majority of Filipino students. The teacher is always at the front, depositing information. She is perceived as the expert, right? While the students are supposed to be the consumer of information. So it has normalized students as mere consumer of knowledge. However, the flexible learning environment, what we are now, we need a shift in perspective and teaching practices. The current situation is teaching us to decenter our roles and authorities as teachers, from a passive technician to a reflective practitioner. And what does a reflective practitioner do? So basically, it is utilizing a repertoire of understandings, images, and actions to reframe a troubling situation so that problem-solving actions are generated. And that's what we are doing now, which is actually really, really great. But at the same time, we have to go back to our classroom, right? When there's a problem that happens or when a student drops out, or when a student is struggling in terms of like submitting their requirements, or in terms of like not being able to access the materials, what do we do, right? So we have to be a reflective practitioner We have to continually evaluate our teaching practices so that we can perhaps make good decisions. And at the same time, we make sound pedagogical decisions. All right. So the new flexible learning environment, the focus is the learner, but we have to also think about the interaction between the learner and the instructor. How is the best way, what is the best way through which learner and instructor interacts? How about learner to learner interaction? This is another thing that we should think about. When we design materials, I think it's very important that the learners don't feel isolated, because it can also have impact on their mental health. So our materials should not forget that there should be a way for learners to interact with each other. And at the same time, how do we imagine the learner interacting with the course contents, right? Is it through a computer? Is it through a book or a hard copy? Is it through other means of information, other modalities, right? And how does the learner interact with the community of practice? Do we actually allow, maybe this is the best time to do it, right? Do we actually invite professionals or those target community of practice? So for instance, if you are teaching engineering students, perhaps you can invite an engineer to talk to your students through online or through Zoom, or perhaps you can talk to a social worker if your student is in social work, right, to talk about their experience. Have we actually included that in our curriculum? And the modalities, are we going to do synchronous, asynchronous? Are we doing it like modular? Students bring a hard copy of their materials. Is it a face-to-face but limited face-to-face? So these are some of the things that we need to think, rethink, and reimagine when we're doing flexible learning teaching environment. Okay? And however, as critical teachers, we always have to, again, take note that in flexible learning environments, students have much freedom. As I said earlier, we have to decenter our power because this is about them. That's why we're doing this, right? We have to redesign the curriculum and materials to fit the context and also to fit the realities that many of our students right now may actually encounter challenges. We also need to reimagine assessment, and that's very important because we're no longer there to actually monitor how students are being assessed. And also, again, we have to think about student access, okay? Always think about student access when we design our course materials and our curriculum. Are they actually able to access it on their own? Not just about like physically accessing the materials, but when they're doing it on their own, can they actually figure out the instructions? Can they understand the materials the way it is written? All right. So another important aspect to think about is student engagement. How do you engage students with this kind of learning environment? Because there is a study, at least based on experience, most of my students feel like there was less student engagement, right? I think a very important aspect is to establish teacher presence when you're doing a flexible learning environment. At the same time, we need to learn how to manage feedback, okay? So I think Amphi and the others have talked about this before, but I would like to add that feedback is very important. So, you know, if you're doing online discussion, teacher presence need to be there. You have to provide feedback so that students know that you are actually monitoring their work, which is actually the third bullet point there. Okay. Now, these are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves as well. How do COVID-19 and the transition to more flexible learning environments impact on how we evaluate student learning? For instance, have you guys considered a needs analysis survey? That's something, again, that's something important that we need to explore. And this second one, I would like to emphasize is, have we done learner training so that they get ready to use affordances of technology, right? So for instance, if you're using Google Meet, have you actually trained the students on how to use Google Meet? If you're using Facebook, have you actually done a training on how to fully utilize Facebook? Because sometimes there are students who just use the basics of Facebook, but there are actually, you know, like hacks that help them make Facebook work better for them? And what are the alternatives to regular quizzes and problem sets if you are teaching math, right? Or if not, case studies? What would lab experiments look like in a flexible learning environment? And how do we make sure that students read and use reliable sources in this time of fake news, deep fakes, and trolls? So these are questions that are very important to ask when we're teaching in the humanities and social sciences. All right, and I would also like to invite the teachers to do critical assessment. I know that this might be pushing it much further, but we're critical thinkers and we're critical teachers. We're encouraged to be critical. So I hope you guys try to explore this, and be open to learn about critical assessment. There should be some materials out there that you can use to actually research about it. One is from fixed or predetermined assessment, because we're used to the fact that we make or create how students are assessed, but perhaps we can explore the notion of negotiated assessment, right? And when I mean negotiated, is we basically encourage the students to participate in the making of assessment. Through what mode can students best demonstrate learning? That's another important question. And we have to consider non-traditional means of assessment, such as role-playing, skits, poetry, script writing, journaling, student-led conferences, and group projects. I think this is very important, instead of just, because they encourage student participation and collaboration. And at the same time, we have to use multiple assessment procedures. Shohami, who is a critical assessment scholar, such as portfolios, self and peer assessment, projects, observations, student reports on long-term projects, and also tests. So multiple assessment procedures is more of holistic way of assessing student progress. Another way of doing it is to involve students in the process of deciding what types of tests or assessment tools will be used to measure their learning. And I have done this in my class, and it's actually quite fun. So what I did was I would group the students into 4 small groups, and then they would work together in Google Slides, in Google's Doc, and then they would make suggestions on how they will be graded, and the assessment tools, and especially the rubric as well. I engage them in conversations. Negotiate writing projects and assignment deadlines with students. I have done that a couple of times, and the students seem to like it. Allow students to generate assessment criteria and scoring rubrics. I think Sir Arvin Narvasa of USTP have done this also in his class. I have also done it in my class, so therefore, 2 different contexts, and it's possible, so why not, allow it to actually happen perhaps in your class. Engage students in dialogue in regard to grade percentage distribution. I have also done this because sometimes, there are things that we see from our perspective, but perhaps the students have actually other ways of looking at it. And use former and current students' work in designing assessment materials. You can actually, for instance, there's a student work that was done before, and perhaps you can use this as a model, or if not, when you provide students, okay, this is something that you should aim for, or if not, you can use it as a material for a quiz or an assignment. Perhaps it can be a reading material, and then the reading material can also be used as a assessment material. So here's an example of what I did in my class. Instead of simple essay, what I did was I explored a multilingual, multimodal text expressing creativity and criticality in my students. So we were discussing, because I teach Philippine culture from a critical perspective. So we were talking about the experiences of Filipinos working abroad. And this is what my students created. Instead of just writing a simple essay, they made a poster, which is multimodal and multilingual. Look how intelligent the students are. #katulong, #servants, and then for too long. So for too long, so they're playing, and then with words there, for, and then for, and too long. Too long is also, it also means help. And I would say this is really, really smart. And the images that they also came up with to reinforce the message are historically grounded, right? And I think that's very, very important to take note. So it shows that your students were learning. Like for instance, we have a lot of nurses. We had a lot of like people who are working on ships and then airplanes leaving basically. And also these are symbols of Filipinos in the US first work. They are plantation workers, pineapple plantation workers. They were harvesting um, grapes, right? And other. Okay, so we're almost done. I would now like to talk about the intersection between critical thinking and technology and the need for critical digital literacy. And why is that? It's because of the convergence of so many aspects of our lives into technology. So we have here the convergence of content, right? Computing experience, communication, and they all converge in media. At the same time, this is another representation of convergent technology. Like now, everything can be accessed through the phone. Like, can you imagine? Like now, you can just order through your phone. You can do banking on your phone. Like what I do, I've done a lot of things just through the phone. I can even edit videos on my phone. I do emails with my students on the phone. So, but however, we have to be responsible as teachers. We have to be critical in our use of technology. And I think a lot of us are, it is important to remember that. And it's because of the fact that the digital landscape, not only has it converged, but it has also diverged in different aspects of our lives. There are technologies that have now focused on health and the content. First it converged and then it diverged, and now it's complicated, right? In fact, like for instance, the Grab issue in the Philippines, I guess is part of the digital landscape. It complicates our experiences if we don't think much about or deeply about technology. So therefore, I would like to encourage everyone to be critically literate, to be critically digitally literate. Okay. So the fact is we navigate fluidly between the ethical and personal, the objective and subjective, and the creative and the critical when we are in digital spaces. And sometimes we forget that we are teachers, and that's why some teachers, post fake news on their social media account, and it's worrying, right? So we have to be educated on the constructive use of digital technology. Okay, that's very important. And in order to do this, we have to always be analytical when we engage with technology. Okay, to make our practices ethical and to avoid the exploitation and manipulation of others. Either we manipulate others or we get manipulated because of technology. And I've noticed that, in order for you to be able to do this, you have to know, for instance, how does editing a picture work? Like there's this prominent politician, right? And she always gets fake news. A lot of people share like her saying something, but it's actually an edited text. It's so easy right now to put a picture of somebody and then put a text and claim that she said that. For instance, a while back or yesterday, Philippine Daily Inquirer had to make a clarification that Michael V, they did not publish about the death of Michael V, but it was actually a fake account. But they still used the Inquirer.net label. So it's very important that we need to be educated about these things. If you have time, you should research about how deep fake works, how trolling works, and what are the ethical ways of handling these things. Because digital critical literacy involves a lot of things. It involves code breaking, we have to navigate through these things. It involves meaning making. We have to read, relate, and express. We also talk about reputation management, participation. It involves analyzing. It involves using and creating materials when we are able to do digital technology. Perhaps not everyone is comfortable with technology, but this new normal, the pandemic, is actually inviting us to engage more with technology and how to be responsible to use it. Believe it or not, in recent days or weeks, I've come to be comfortable editing videos, and now I have a YouTube channel because of the new normal, and I studied how to learn to use editing videos, and yeah, it's actually quite a fun experience. But at the same time, with a uh, thinking that I can be possible I could be possibly saying something sensitive, right? So we have to be careful when we're sharing content on social media or even on YouTube or wherever we publish our content. So I would like to end with this quote: if we are to succeed in educating our youth during these uncertain times, we need to think more critically about our curricular and pedagogical decisions so that our students, regardless of social and economic backgrounds, are given equal opportunities and flexible learning environments. So that's it for me for today. I would like to again encourage you guys to do the 3-2-1 reflection for reflective teachers. 3 things that I learned. What are the 3 things that you learned today? What are the 2 things that you're curious about? And what one way do you plan to use the new knowledge that you have gained from this session? So please post them in the comment section. And also you can use this in your own classes when you actually provide materials to your students, right? There's a simple way to engage your students, right? So these are my references. And so daghang salamat, mahalo. If you guys have questions, you may also type those questions in the comment section. You can follow me on ResearchGate. I have my works there, especially in mother tongue, Philippine mother tongue, and other research projects that I have done in the past. You may also follow me on my YouTube channel, Dudong's World, where I talk about my travel and experiences of living abroad, living in Hawaii. There will be more educational content in my YouTube channel in the future. So thank you so much if you guys have questions. And I hope that this session has been useful and meaningful, and you guys will apply some of these concepts or ideas in your own flexible teaching environment. All right, so mahalo nui liwa. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention. All right.